It's an interesting photograph, isn't it? Little old lady, 3 smiling protectors around her, but carrying, automatic rifles, machine guns. And, this fella here has a pistol on his hip. The people in the photograph, the uniformed people in the photograph, are members of what was called the RUC. And the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, was the police force of the state of Northern Ireland from its foundation in 1920 up until 1997-98 with the Good Friday Agreement, when they were replaced by the PSNI. Why is this of any significance to us? Seamus Heaney was born in 1939 in County Derry, one of the 6 counties of the statelet of Northern Ireland, the state of Northern Ireland. And Seamus Heaney was a Catholic, so he was born into the nationalist population. When Northern Ireland was formed as a state, it was formed as a state. Now, this isn't historically accurate, this quote, but the quote that I think sums up a lot of the attitude of the ruling people in Northern Ireland was that James Craig, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, was quoted as saying, and I think it is a misquote, that it would be that the Parliament in Northern Ireland, that Stormont, would be a Protestant Parliament for Protestant people. Now, whether or not he actually ever said those words, certainly that sentiment was the dominant sentiment in the life experience of people living in that state in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, up until the late 1960s. Because it was a state, and I don't want to be controversial here, in which sectarianism dominated everyday life. So the Protestant Unionists, majority of the population, ran the state, and the Catholic nationalist minority of the population had suffered from what we call sectarian discrimination. Now, that all came to a head in the late 1960s when there was an outbreak. Just give me 1 second, I'm going to close this door. When there was an outbreak of, it's very complicated, but civil disobedience, violence, beginning in the city of Derry, which then snowballed into what we would now know as the Troubles, this terrible, essentially civil war that ripped that society apart for the next 30 years. Seamus Heaney's writing this poem in the late 60s. It was published in his collection, very famous collection, A Door into the Dark. So he's writing this poem and he's about 30 years old. And he's reflecting on a childhood experience. And it's a brilliantly drawn example of how Heaney can use a narrative approach to imply observations rather than overtly state things. So in the story of the poem, it's a narrative, as I said. I'm going to write here. He tells the story of a childhood memory, and it's the memory of the visit of a policeman, a constable, who's a member of the RUC. So he's a member of an organisation that Catholics or nationalists feel intimidated by or discriminated against by. And this man has come to Seamus Heaney's family home. You might have watched the video Mossbawn Sunlight. Family home at Mossbawn. And he's acting as an agent for the revenue, the tax collecting part of the government. So essentially Seamus Heaney's dad's a farmer, and this policeman has come to the house to check the father's books, that he has declared all his income and everything is above board. So it's a minor incident, but it's remembered in this incredibly forensic detail. And for me, before we read the poem, what I want you to understand is, for me, what I've always understood here, what Heaney is doing is taking a single incident, a single event that doesn't appear to be of huge importance, a microcosm, and he's using it to kind of look at, like a specimen, to look at the overall experiences of what it was like to be a nationalist in the sectarian state. And I don't think it's any coincidence that he's writing this poem in the late 60s when the very, very great tensions, the civil rights tensions, which, as I said, led into violence and the Troubles, when those tensions are really at the tip, the surface of daily life in his homeland. So let's have a look at the poem. It's not a hard poem, it's very interesting. So it's divided into a sequence of quatrains, so stanzas of 4 lines each. There's no particular meter or rhyming scheme. It's written in free verse. It's very much Heaney's controlled and conversational style. There's a beautiful fluency to the way he writes. Okay, let's go. His bicycle stood at the windowsill, the rubber cowl of a mud splasher skirting the front mudguard, its fat black handle grips heating in sunlight, the spud of the dynamo gleaming and cocked back, the pedal treads hanging relieved of the boot of the law. Now, if nothing else, what Heaney is doing there is creating a dramatic and interesting opening to his story. There's a real tension. Simply, there's a bicycle leaning against the wall of the house, and Heaney is describing it in really forensic detail. If you've watched your Elizabeth Bishop video content, you'll have heard me talk about how Bishop has this meticulous forensic eye for detail, and it is something that really good writers employ in order to stimulate the imagination of their reader. So when we read this, we can see the bike. We can see where it is. It's at the windowsill. There's, of course, Heaney's, one of the things you'll see about Heaney in the mind map is his characteristic use of compound words. It has a mud guard or mud splasher. It's made of rubber, sitting over the mud guard. The handle grips are black and they're fat. It's warm. It's a warm day. There's a dynamo, which is like a little, you know, we have e-bikes today. Well, this was like a kind of a proto e-bike where you had a little dynamo, which is something which creates energy on the bike. You had a spoke. You had something in the spokes of the wheel. It creates friction. It charges the dynamo. So when you're going up a hill, it gives you a bit of energy. But Heaney is describing this in forensic detail, which makes us wonder why. What's the significance of this bicycle? And he comes to that in the second stanza. Lovely use of enjambment or enjambment between the first and second stanza. Lovely use of assonance with fat and black and handle, of alliteration with handle and heating, of sibilance with sunlight and spud. It's the combination of those techniques that creates a real raw flow and rhythm. So while his tone is conversational, or the style feels conversational, that's very much due to his control over language. And you can refer to those techniques like assonance. Like alliteration. And like sibilance, which is the repetition of the S sound. Assonance is the repetition of the internal vowel sounds. And alliteration is the repetition of the initial sounds of words like handle, grips, and heating. But what's interesting is the phrase cocked back and the phrase boot of the law. When he says cocked back, he's referring to whether or not the dynamo is pulled back to charge. But when we hear the phrase cocked back, we think of guns, we think of revolvers. You cock back the revolver, pull a bullet into the chamber, and that's an intimidating image. When we hear the phrase the boot of the law, he's talking about the pedals of the bike, which have been cycled by a policeman, so his boots, the boot of the law. But the boot of the law is a symbol of oppression. So what Heaney's doing here is he's not saying we felt oppressed when the policeman came to visit our home because of the sectarian war we lived in, but he's certainly suggesting that. He's alluding to it. There's a bit of mystery, but it's clear enough what he's referring to. So that's a good example of his use of symbolism. He then, in the next 3 stanzas, brings us into the family home and describes, don't forget, he's a narrative writer. And as I said before, all good narrative writers need to remember certain key qualities in good narrative writing, one of which is characterization. So we get a really kind of close-up forensic description of the Constable. Heaney's poetry is associated with his habit of writing these pen portraits. So if you read Mossbawn Sunlight, if you read The Tolland Man, if you read The Harvest Bow, like, you meet characters in his poems. So here we have the Constable. His cap was upside down on the floor next to his chair. Again, really, really, really forensic incidental details. They don't appear to be important, but they help draw the image. The line of pressure ran like a bevel in his slightly sweating hair. You can see the sibilance there of slightly sweating. So there's an indentation. I cycle, and when I take my helmet off, there's often a little indentation like a bevel. So we can see he's warm because it's a warm day, and he takes off his hat and there's the mark on his head. So the kid, Seamus Heaney, as a child, is really looking at this man very carefully. Why? His visit is obviously of great importance. He had unstrapped a heavy ledger. So the ledger is this is pre-digital age, so it's a book where accounts are written down. And my father was making tillage returns in acres, roods and purchase. So the book is the ledger. His father is telling him, well, I grew so many turnips, I grew so much wheat, I grew so many potatoes. He's doing his returns, okay? So nothing complicated, nothing simple. And what Heaney does there is then, he juxtaposes the banal with the profound, because he uses those three words there. So we've got this image of a farmer sitting down saying, yeah, well, I grew this many potatoes, this many turnips, and so on, this many carrots. And then it's followed by this really short, suspenseful sentence, arithmetic and fear. Now, what's he saying there? He's not saying like me in maths class in school, like, oh God, because I'm so bad at maths. No, what he's saying is that there was a very palpable, you could feel it in the air, tension in the room. He's saying that the father and the family were afraid of this man, that there was a real sense of being intimidated, that they didn't want to make a mistake because they were afraid of the consequences. And that line is one of the lines you learn from this poem. And even though it's only 3 words, it will be in your little quotes test that's, follows this in the knowledge checks, because it's a key moment in the poem. It shows how Heaney's economic or very precise or careful use of language can convey so much. The boy continues staring at the constable. I was staring at the polished holster. Now, if he's wearing a holster, he's carrying a gun. With its buttoned flap, the blade cord looped into the revolver butt. So this man has come into their home carrying a gun. He brings into their home fear. He's associated with oppression, the boot of the law. So this man is intimidating to these people. These people who are not political, they're just getting on with their life, but his presence is a frightening, his visit is a frightening event. Heaney then brings in his story, so we have an engaging opening, we have a scenario, we have characterization, now we have a bit of dialogue. Any other crops, mangolds, marrow stems, anything like that? The father's response is monosyllabic, no. And then the child asks himself a question. But was there not a line of turnips where the seed ran out in the potato field? I assumed small guilt and sat imagining the black hole in the barracks. Now look at that again example of dramatic contrast or juxtaposition. Again, the contrast between the banal, the trivial, and the profound, the really important. What's Heaney doing here? So the story is that the policeman says to the father, is there anything else you want to declare? The father says no. But the child knows they grew a line of turnips and his daddy hasn't told the policeman. So the child immediately, because this is what children do, they immediately blow it all out of proportions and they worry, oh my God, I'm going to end up in the jailhouse. I'm going to end up in a black hole in the barracks. Lovely use of alliteration with the B there. But of course, Heaney's not just commenting there on childhood innocence. He's commenting on the fear amongst his community that any transgression will be met with disproportionate reaction from the authorities. The whole thing is a symbol which represents a cultural feeling, a feeling of being under threat, a feeling that the police are not there to protect. In the South, when the state was split, we called our police force the Garda Síochána, which means the guardians of the peace. When the settlement came with the Good Friday Agreement in 1997 in the North, they renamed the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the Police Service of Northern Ireland. The message being that we're not here to oppress you, we're here to serve you. In the South, to guard the peace. And of course, that's the opposite of what the RUC represented to the nationalist community. Whatever the rights or wrongs, the RUC to the nationalist community were regarded as being a sectarian organisation who would punish any nationalist who broke the rules or challenged the status quo. And that's why the child, when he thinks about the line of turnips, imagines the black hole in the barracks. Anyway, we're going to come now to the best line in the poem. He stood up, shifted the baton case further around his belt. So not only does he have a gun, he has a baton. So he's a man who can do big violence if he needs to. And then the best line of the poem. And it's only a very short image. Closed the Doomsday Book. Oh, sorry. God damn. The Doomsday Book. Now that is what we call an historical allusion. So an allusion is a reference to pre-existing knowledge, and so the poet is referring to something from history. Now, as readers, we might not know that, and it is pronounced Doomsday, not Domesday. As readers, we might not know what the Doomsday Book is, but it challenges us, it adds nuance, it adds subtlety to the poem. It makes us want to go and find out what was the Doomsday Book to understand that symbol. So that's a good thing in poetry, not a bad thing. But that reference to the Doomsday Book is really important, because the Doomsday Book, historically speaking, is a symbol of oppression. I won't get into the history lesson now, but it's a reference to 1066, to when the Kingdom of England was conquered by the Normans, and how the Normans then went out around their new kingdom and collected information, data, so that the people could be taxed. And that taxation was part of the oppression of one people by another. So when Heaney describes this ledger, this little accounts book that's been used in rural County Derry to keep an eye on what farmers are growing and how many pence farmers are making, he uses it as a symbol to represent something really important. The oppression of one people by another, the sense of a people being oppressed. And that's what he writes the poem about. And that's why he comes at the end of the poem to this extraordinary finish. He says that the constable fitted his cap back with two hands, looked at me as he said goodbye, so a sense of being intimidated. He looks out the window, he sees him getting on the bike, a shadow bobbed in the window. He was snapping, gorgeous use of alliteration there, of onomatopoeia with snapping, you can hear the sound. The carrier spring over the ledger, his boot pushed off, and then the wonderful final line, and you learn that as well, and the bicycle ticked, ticked, ticked. So there's not a huge amount of quotation to learn from this poem. You learn the bicycle tick, tick, ticked. You learn Doomsday Book. You learn arithmetic and fear. You learn the boot of the law and cocked back. Those are the symbols. That's all you need, really, to talk about this poem. There are other quotes. Your teacher might tell you to learn the first opening stanza. There might be other things. But in terms of your preparation, if you had those short quotes ready, you'd have loads to say about this poem. So why is it significant that the poem ends with the bicycle tick, tick, tick? First of all, the tick, tick, tick is the reference to the sound that is made when a bicycle has a dynamo. So again, if I didn't explain it properly, dynamo is a little, like an engine, and it's charged by friction. So there's a little piece of metal or a little piece of plastic that's stuck in to the spokes, and as the spokes go around, it creates friction which charges the dynamo. So that creates a ticking sound, okay, as the bicycle moves. Now, so that's the literal meaning of that image. But ask yourself, what else ticks? Clocks tick, time moves on. So this is 30 years, 20 years in the past. Heaney's about 30 years of age writing this poem. He's a child when the events of the poem happened, so maybe 8, 9, 10 years of age, so 20 or so years in the gap. So time moves on. What else ticks? Bombs tick. Okay? The idea of tick, 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 boom. And for me, and I'm okay, I don't mind if teachers tell you, no, Paul's wrong on this. I don't care. I think Heaney leaves the opening with the bicycle tick, 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 because he wants us to have an opinion. He wants us to think about what he means. And here's what I think he means. I think he's writing this poem in the late 60s when he can see the build up and build up and build up of tension all around him, the explosion of violence that comes in Northern Ireland. And I think what he's saying is, if you want to understand where all the tension, where the violence is coming from in the place he lives, it's coming from not a day, not a week, not a month, but years and decades of this kind of oppression, of this kind of pressure. And eventually, there's going to be an explosive reaction. And that's, I think, why he ends the poem with that. He's trying to understand not the world as it was then, but he's actually trying to understand the world as it was when he wrote the poem. So in the now, in the contemporary now, when he wrote the poem, and he understands the connection between the past and the present. And of course, that is a key thematic concern in Heaney's poetry. The profound connection between the past, the present, and indeed what's to come in the future. So that's A Constable Calls by Seamus Heaney.